At the beginning of 1946, when many parts of Europe were already trying to leave the horror behind, a group of women was brought before a tribunal in Gdansk. They were not high-ranking officers, nor responsible for designing genocidal policies. They were young women, most with no military experience, who had served as guards at the Stutthof concentration camp. Some had previously worked as secretaries, others as waitresses. They all shared something. They had been part of the daily routine of a place built to kill. Stutthof was neither the largest nor the most famous camp, but it operated for almost the entire war. There, the female guards had an active role. They controlled prisoners, administered punishments, and oversaw marches to the gas chambers. When the camp was liberated, several were captured, publicly tried, and hanged before thousands of people in one of the most symbolic post-war events in Poland. How did they become so deeply involved in that system? What truly motivated them? The origin of terror. Stutthof, which from the beginning was used as a place to imprison Polish opponents, gradually transformed into a center where people were systematically eliminated. In 1939, it began as a site to detain prisoners, but over the years it expanded and changed its function. It became a key component in the organized extermination of Jews, Soviet prisoners, and other groups labeled as enemies. Crematoria were installed there, equipment for using gas was set up, and everything was adjusted to make control more effective. The SS took care to select personnel who not only followed orders, but were also willing to use force without hesitation. As the system required more people to maintain order, women began to be integrated into these roles. They were not office assistants. These female guards were trained in techniques to mistreat, subdue, and psychologically break the inmates. Some even oversaw entire blocks. For example, Gerda Steinhoff, at 23 years old, commanded hundreds of prisoners. Aggression became routine. Shouting, beatings, and even killings were part of everyday life. Stutthof was not just a site with terrible conditions. It was a space where violence became part of the system. The numbers say it all. More than 110,000 people passed through there, and nearly 65,000 did not make it out alive, either within the camp or on the forced marches. Among them were all kinds of people: adults, children, the elderly, men and women. The majority were Jews brought from various parts of Europe, but there were also Poles, captured Russian soldiers and other prisoners. In the final years of the camp, gas chambers were used regularly. But it was not the only method of killing. Executions by shooting were carried out. People were hanged, left to die of hunger or from untreated illnesses. Bodies were piled up and the crematoria operated without rest. Many of the female guards not only witnessed all of this, but participated directly, choosing who was to be executed. Some even volunteered for those tasks. The apparatus that sustained the camp did not function solely through military orders. Behind it was a way of thinking that justified everything. They were told repeatedly that the inmates were not people but enemies. This idea was essential for women who had led ordinary lives to become active participants in the murder system. They did not merely follow instructions. They took initiative. They punished as routine, humiliated by habit, and killed without hesitation. Stories like those of Bachmann, Paradis, or Klaff were not isolated cases. They represented a more widespread behavior, where women were also active elements in the crimes of the Nazi regime. They were not just present, they were part of the system that carried out the mass killings. Although later many tried to explain themselves or claimed they were just obeying, the records and testimonies clearly show the role they played. On the 25th of January 1945, when it was already clear that the Red Army was approaching, the order was given to evacuate the camp. Thus began the so-called death marches. Thousands of prisoners were forced to walk for weeks in the middle of winter and without food. Many did not make it. Some were shot if they tried to escape. The female guards were there too, watching, pushing, assaulting. When the Soviets arrived at the ruins of the camp, they found empty facilities and remnants of the extermination system. Not many living prisoners remained. Only a few witnesses who, despite everything, managed to survive the marches. Official documents, abandoned objects, and testimonies collected later helped to reconstruct what had happened there. Stutthof was not as well known as Auschwitz, but its operation was no less brutal or organized. In the days following the liberation, Soviet forces and then the Poles began collecting evidence. Hundreds of bodies were found, barracks full of clothes, piles of personal belongings, and structures adapted for mass murder. Most of those responsible had already left, but as the months passed, they began to be located. Some tried to hide or change their identity. Others, like the younger female guards, returned to their towns thinking no one would come after them. The process of identifying the women involved was not immediate. Many witnesses were scattered, others were afraid to speak. But little by little, and thanks to the collaboration of survivors and internal records, the list of names was assembled. The most recognized were easy to identify by their behavior in the camp. Their nicknames, physical descriptions, and actions were etched into the collective memory of the victims. Throughout 1945 and 1946, the Polish administration, with Soviet support, organized a series of trials in Gdansk, formerly Danzig. There, not only SS men were placed in the dock, but also women. Among them were some of the most violent figures of the Stutthof camp. The images of the trials, the testimonies, and the sentences showed young female guards, many under 30 years old, facing charges for crimes against humanity. The witnesses' testimonies were direct. They spoke of beatings, humiliations, executions, and scenes of extreme cruelty. Several survivors agreed in describing how some SS women seemed to enjoy the suffering of others. There was no room for doubt. The evidence was clear and overwhelming. The convictions soon followed. Several were sentenced to death. Others received prison terms. A few received light sentences or even freedom, due to lack of evidence or cooperation with the prosecutors. The trial closed a dark chapter of the camp, but it also opened a discussion that continues to this day. How did such young women become part of such a machine? What led them to act with such violence? Were they just executors, or also convinced supporters of the system? What is certain is that Stutthof made it clear that Nazi terror did not have only a male face. The routine of fear in Stutthof. Herta Botha, Wanda Klaff and Paradis were some of the most remembered faces for what happened in Stutthof, one of the lesser-known camps, but where brutality was a daily occurrence. There, thousands of people, mostly Jews, endured situations that today seem impossible. These women, regardless of their age or whether they were mothers, young or peasants, became executioners. They beat relentlessly, punished anyone, and did not hesitate to mistreat children, the elderly, or pregnant women. Physical pain, mental destruction, and gas chambers were not isolated incidents. They were part of daily life. They did not act on impulse. Everything was part of a structure designed and applied with cold precision. On the 20th of January 1942, 14 key figures of the Nazi regime met in Berlin to finalize the details of what they called the final solution. At the Wannsee Conference, they established how millions of Jews would be eliminated in an organized manner. It was not an improvised decision. Since Hitler rose to power, the measures against Jews had become increasingly harsh, and what began with social exclusion ended in systematic killings. This meeting served as the foundation for implementing that extermination policy in all the camps, including Stutthof. With that plan in motion, the Nazis built new camps in occupied Poland, places where prisoners lived under torture, hunger, and constant fear. Some of those camps became sadly notorious for the way they treated people. Those who survived told stories that are barely imaginable. Hunger so intense they could not move, punishments that left their backs without skin, and nights filled only with screams. The body and mind gradually faded. Before all this, Jews in Germany were part of the country like any other group. But when Hitler took control and propaganda began to repeat that they were the cause of all problems, everything changed. Society gradually accepted that lie. In 1935, with the Nuremberg laws, they were stripped of citizenship. They lost their rights, could not marry Germans or work in certain places. They were reduced to a status that left them outside society. In this way, taking their lives became something many no longer saw as a crime. Conditions inside Stutthof were a mix of punishment and neglect. They slept in barracks that could not hold everyone, on wooden beds or directly on the floor. The food was minimal. A piece of hard bread, some watery soup, and little else. If anyone tried to get more, they were beaten or sent to forced labor. In winter, the cold seeped in everywhere. Many froze to death or died from untreated diseases. Hygiene was non-existent. Clothes were not washed, and lifeless bodies piled up near the barracks. Each guard had a specific task. Some controlled labor, others supervised punishments. Others decided who lived and who died that day. It was not occasional. It was a system in which every part fit together to cause the greatest possible suffering. The SS women did not just follow orders. Many stood out for their violence. They shouted, beat and shot. Some had trained dogs they unleashed on the prisoners. Everything was calculated to break the prisoner physically and emotionally. The day began early, sometimes before dawn. Line-ups for roll call were mandatory, whether it snowed or rained. If someone moved, fell, or did not respond quickly, they were beaten or pulled out of line for separate punishment. Then came the day's orders. Cleaning, transporting stones, digging trenches, carrying corpses. The tasks were repetitive, heavy, and without rest. Breaks did not exist. If someone fell to the ground, they were left there or finished off with a bullet. The guards knew the terrain well. They knew how to break the prisoners, not only with physical punishments, but also with constant humiliations. Many times inmates were forced to sing while carrying bodies or digging their own graves. If they refused, they were beaten unconscious. Orders were not questioned. Everything they did had a purpose: to crush dignity. Punishments were as common as the hard bread at breakfast. A minor error, like speaking out of turn or looking at the ground, could end with a beating or days locked in a cell without food. The most violent female guards became feared even among camp staff. There was one who beat anyone who did not move quickly with a plank. Another unleashed her dog without warning. Everyone knew who they were, and no one wanted to cross paths with them. In the infirmary, things were no better. Few were treated. It was often used as a discard area. Those who arrived injured knew they would likely not leave alive. Conditions were so bad that many preferred to avoid it, even if it meant dying slowly in their barrack. SS female guards also monitored this space. If someone screamed or asked for help, they were silenced with blows or transferred to an even worse area. Female prisoners suffered constant abuse. Many were selected for harsher forced labor just on a whim. Some were subjected to special punishments. They were beaten in front of everyone, humiliated, denied food for days. It was a form of control. Others were forced to clean with toothbrushes or spend hours kneeling in the rain. The goal was clear: to destroy the will. Despite everything, some prisoners tried to resist in silence. They shared a bit of bread, a blanket, a word of support. But the system was designed to crush any gesture of humanity. Informants were everywhere. A single word could land someone on the punishment list. Distrust settled like a fog. Each day was a battle to survive without being seen. That organized terror did not arise from nothing. It was applied with clear rules, repeated again and again. The punishments, the marches, the senseless labor, all were part of a routine designed to wear down the inmates until they broke. The female guards were not accessories, they were essential parts. Without them, the system would not have worked the same. They beat, shouted, forced, watched. They were in every corner of the camp. This was the daily life in Stutthof, without respite, without rest, with pain as the norm. What was lived there was not improvised. It was a perfectly greased mechanism to destroy those who entered its gates, and many of those who kept that machine running wore braids, shiny boots, and a uniform they wore with pride. From selection to crematorium. The gas chambers of Stutthof were not simple hidden facilities. They were the final step in a carefully designed routine. In that place, inmates did not arrive by chance. They had previously gone through selections, lists, and entire days of senseless forced labor. It was a process, a gearwork of decisions that stretched from the offices of the Nazi commanders to the direct gaze of an SS guard. They, just like their superiors, knew perfectly well what the outcome was for those marked with a cross. Selections were constant, sometimes without warning. They came down from the barracks, lined up the prisoners, and chose. No words were needed. A gesture was enough. The weakest, the sick, those who could no longer stand, were separated. Some knew what was coming. Others still thought they would be sent to another job. The SS women took part in these selections without showing doubt. They looked quickly, pointed, and moved on to the next. The gas chamber at Stutthof was officially installed in 1943. Although other methods had already been used, such as lethal injections or shootings, this new way of killing was more efficient. It was located near the crematorium, separate from the rest of the camp. There, in a windowless room, the chosen ones were locked in. Instead of showers, Zyklon B gas rained down. a substance that took the air from those who inhaled it in minutes. It was silent. No gunshots, no screams outside, just the sound of metal closing and the guards' footsteps as they walked away. The women who served as guards in that part of the camp knew everything that was happening. It was no secret. They escorted the groups. Sometimes they held their hands so they wouldn't run. Other times they forced them with shouts and blows from rifle butts. If anyone resisted, they pushed them directly to the ground. The time between selection and death was short. There was no trial, no explanation, just orders and routine. The bodies left behind after each session were removed by other prisoners. Many of them knew they would end the same way. But in the meantime, they had to carry their own companions, clean everything and go back to work. It was part of the psychological punishment. For the living to take part in the process. For the prisoners not only to fear death, but also to be forced to collaborate. That mechanism was designed to crush any hope. The crematorium operated next door. Sometimes there wasn't enough firewood or time, so the corpses were piled up by shifts. They were arranged in rows according to who had arrived first. If an entire group was exterminated, days would pass before their remains disappeared. The ashes were scattered, buried, or used as fill. Nothing remained. Not a name, not a grave. The most disturbing thing was the normality with which everything was done. The female guards ate, slept, chatted, and then escorted people to death. Some did it without raising their voices, others with smiles or cold remarks. Some got used to the smell, the muffled screams, the heat from the oven. It was part of their day. Just as one goes to work or school, they went to oversee an extermination routine, and they did it without looking back. The gas arrived in sealed cans, transported in trucks along with other supplies. The cans were opened carefully, and someone would throw the contents through an upper hatch. In seconds, the air became toxic. It was not a long process. A few minutes were enough for silence to fill everything. Then they waited a bit longer, opened the door, and the next step began, removing the bodies. There was no protection. The prisoners assigned to that task worked without gloves, without masks, without rest. They had to lift lifeless bodies, place them in wheelbarrows, or drag them directly to the furnace. The skin, the smell, the heat, all of it was part of the environment. No one said anything. Everyone knew that speaking could cost them their life. Fear was another guard. The female guards who operated in that area showed no emotion. Sometimes they didn't even speak. They just walked, watched, and gave orders with their hands. Some smoked while observing, others looked away. Routine had switched off any human reaction. It was no longer a person dying. It was another number that had to disappear. The furnace never stopped, days running continuously. When firewood was scarce, methods were improvised. The thinner bodies went first. They were placed in layers, combined with wood, with rags, with whatever was available. The goal was to keep the fire from going out. Sometimes the black smoke covered the entire camp. Other times the wind carried it toward the barracks, and the prisoners knew what was happening. Executions were not public, but everyone knew they were happening. It was enough to see the movement near the crematorium, the smoke, the silence that followed. Prisoners counted the absences, the missed shifts, the names no longer heard. Everything was part of a cruel logic. Every phase was planned, from the arrival of the train to the final elimination. The most shocking thing was how the female guards fit into that system. They were not just spectators. They were there every day. Some even helped carry bodies, others gave the signal to close the hatch. And although not all showed the same level of brutality, none refused. None stepped aside. It was their job. They did it because they could, because the uniform allowed them to. In Stutthof, death was not an event. It was just another task, like sweeping, counting, or serving food. And those who carried it out, young women with braids and boots, did so without flinching. That's how the final stretch of horror functioned, without screams, without pauses, without turning back. How the most feared female guards were formed. Among the SS women who worked at Stutthof, some were barely 20 years old. They had arrived at the camp from rural areas with no prior experience, but willing to obey. They entered as assistants or trainee guards, and within a few months they were already participating in selections and punishments. Many adapted quickly. The uniform, the power, and the fear they provoked turned them into figures feared by the prisoners. They didn't have a past marked by violence, but they quickly got used to seeing it. One of them was Jenny Wanda Bachmann. She had the face of a model and was only 24 years old when she arrived at the camp. She was known for her neat appearance and for walking with an elegance that contrasted with the brutality of her actions. She actively participated in executions. She beat inmates with a leather whip and did not hesitate to point out those who should die. She didn't shout. Her orders were cold, curt. For the inmates, seeing her meant immediate danger. Another young figure was Paradis. With a calm appearance, she had a discreet smile that didn't reveal the harm she could inflict. She was in charge of escorting women and children to the extermination zones. According to several witnesses, she struck without warning, especially those who cried or resisted. Her role wasn't limited to accompanying. She gave instructions to the prisoners, pushed them, and sometimes hit them even when they were already inside the gas chamber. Wanda Klaff was another young guard known for her fanaticism. She said she was proud to serve the Third Reich and didn't hide her enthusiasm for punishing. Some remember her laughing while watching over the inmates. She didn't need a specific reason to strike. It was enough for someone to stumble or fail to understand an order. According to testimonies, she sometimes even asked to participate in executions, something not all did voluntarily. These women, though young, were not unaware of how the camp operated. They were trained to know what was expected of them, and many went further. They volunteered for tasks others avoided. It wasn't just obedience. In several cases, they showed initiative. They wanted to prove they could be as efficient as their male counterparts. Some succeeded thoroughly, and that made them even more feared. The training of these young women was not extensive, but it was specific. They received quick lessons on discipline, surveillance, and punishment. In a few weeks, they went from being assistants to having direct responsibility over entire groups of prisoners. They didn't need years of service to become feared. Most of them knew from the beginning what they could do and how far they could go without consequences. Some came from poor families, others sought stability. But once inside the system, they didn't stop. They adapted to the camp environment with a speed that even surprised their superiors. The uniform gave them power, and they used that power with complete confidence. The prisoners knew it, and many preferred to encounter SS men rather than certain young female guards. One of the things that most impressed the inmates was the coldness. It wasn't the shouting that scared them, but the calm manner in which punishments were administered. Some gave orders without raising their voice. Others watched in silence while others beat for them. It was total control without losing composure, a command that wasn't taught, but which they assumed naturally. They were also present on the death marches. When the Soviet front approached and the Nazis evacuated the camps, many of these female guards accompanied the prisoners on forced walks of hundreds of kilometers. They showed no compassion. If someone fell, they left them behind or finished them off. They maintained order with weapons, whips, and threats. It didn't matter that they were far from the camp. They still applied the same level of harshness. Several of these women were captured at the end of the war. Not all managed to flee. Some returned to their villages thinking no one would remember them. But the testimonies identified them. Their faces, their gestures, their words were recognized by those who survived. In the trials, many of them were directly pointed out. The accounts were clear. No one doubted their active participation. During the judicial process in Gdansk, they sat on the same bench as the male officers. There was no distinction. Age or gender were no excuse. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, names, task lists. Some confessed, others tried to deny. But the survivors confronted them with firmness. They remembered every face, every blow, every order received. In the end, several of these young female guards were sentenced to death. They were hanged publicly as a symbol of justice. There were no appeals, no tears either. They climbed the scaffold escorted, while a crowd watched them. Some kept their gaze high, others lowered it, but none asked for forgiveness. They died just as they had lived in the camp, firm, silent, and fully aware of what they had done. The tribunal that sent the SS to the gallows. When the war ended, Poland was no longer the same. Cities lay in ruins, millions of people had died, and the concentration camps left behind an uncomfortable silence. But amid the destruction, the need for justice emerged. In the case of Stutthof, that justice took the form of trials held in Gdansk between April and May of 1946. There, not only SS men were put on trial. Women were also judged, many of them young and without military backgrounds. The tribunal was composed of Polish judges with Soviet support. It was not a closed or secret process. The goal was to show the world what had happened and to make clear that there would be no impunity. Prosecutors gathered testimonies, documents, items collected from the camp, and even photographs. The survivors' statements were a central part of the process. Many of them traveled from other countries to tell what they had lived through. Among the accused were guards known for their brutality. Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Ewa Paradis and Wanda Klaff were some of the most frequently named. Other lesser-known names also appeared, but they were equally involved in the camp's operations. Most did not deny having worked there, but tried to minimize their roles. They claimed to have followed orders, to have been unaware of everything that was happening, or to have carried out minor tasks. But the witnesses told a different story. The sessions were intense. Beatings, executions, forced marches and scenes of sadism were recounted. Some testimonies were so detailed that they left no doubts. Physical descriptions, the phrases used by the accused, their gestures, everything matched. Several witnesses broke into tears as they remembered. Others spoke with contained anger, but all agreed that these women not only obeyed, but participated willingly. The accused sat in a row. They wore civilian clothes, their hair tied back and tense expressions. Some listened with their gaze fixed on the floor. Others looked straight at the judge. Not all showed the same attitude. Some appeared remorseful, others defiant, but none interrupted. They knew their fate was sealed. The maximum penalty was on the table. Sentences were handed down without delay. For several of the guards, the punishment was the gallows. The tribunal ordered that the executions be public. Improvised structures were erected in the square of Gdansk. The local population came en masse. They wanted to see with their own eyes those who had wielded absolute power in the camps, now subjected to the verdict of the law. Images of the gallows spread throughout the country. They were a direct message. No one would go unpunished. Jenny Wanda Bachmann was one of the first to climb the scaffold. She remained calm until the end. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply walked in silence and climbed the steps. Ewa Paradis followed. She staggered a bit but did not scream. Wanda Klaff, on the other hand, murmured a few words before the rope was tightened. Witnesses remembered that moment as a necessary closure, not a vengeance but a sign that justice had been done. The executioners were members of the new Polish administration. None of them showed hesitation. The ceremony was swift. There were no pauses or speeches. Only names read aloud, firm steps and a final breath. The women hung from the ropes while the public remained silent. Then, slowly, the crowd dispersed. In total, 11 people were executed that day. 9 men and 2 additional women besides the 3 mentioned guards. All had worked in Stutthof or its subcamps. The evidence against them was clear: signed documents, issued orders, matching statements. Prosecutors had closed each case with precision. No room was left for doubt. After the executions, authorities allowed the bodies to be buried in unmarked graves. They did not want to turn them into symbols. There would be no plaques, no memorials, no flowers, just earth over them. Thus ended the public story of those who for years had decided over the lives and deaths of thousands. The Stutthof trial marked a difference from other proceedings. Here, high-ranking Nazi figures were not judged. It was about lower-level personnel, guards and auxiliaries, young women with no military rank. And yet, justice made no distinction. It was proven that responsibility did not depend on rank but on actions, that those who participated actively, even if they were young or women, would also be held accountable. This is how Gerda Steinhoff fell, Stutthoff's Iron Fist. Gerda Steinhoff arrived at Stutthof when she was only 23 years old. Before that, she had worked as a domestic assistant and later as a tram conductor. Her entry into the camp was swift. Within weeks, she went from being a trainee to becoming one of the most well-known guards in the place. Not just because of her constant presence, but also due to her active participation in selections for the gas chambers. Unlike others, she didn't stay on the sidelines. She took initiative. She had an ordinary appearance, but her attitude stood out. Always upright with a serious expression, she was seen by the prisoners as a figure of authority. She didn't need to shout to assert herself. She walked among the inmates with a firm step, gave direct orders and punished without hesitation. Some survivors remembered her presence as intimidating, even more so than that of the SS men. They knew that if she appeared during a selection, something bad was going to happen. Her job wasn't just to supervise. Gerda organized transfers, formed lines of prisoners, and was responsible for deciding who lived and who didn't. She was aware of the entire process, from the arrival of the deportees to their final destination. She wasn't a mere witness. According to trial documents, she took part in at least a dozen selections for the gas chamber, and she didn't do it out of obligation, but with efficiency. The way she treated the prisoners was direct. She didn't use insults or verbal abuse. Her power lay in the confidence with which she acted. One of her orders was enough for other guards to act. Even among the most experienced prisoners, her name caused tension. No one wanted to cross her path. She was unpredictable. She didn't need reasons to punish or point someone out. In the final months of the camp, when the Nazis already knew the war was lost, Steinhoff maintained her routine. She didn't slow down. She continued to be present in the harshest tasks. Some witnesses said that even then, when many sought to disappear, she kept showing up at selections. She didn't seem affected by fear of the end. She remained firm, as if nothing were going to change. When the Red Army approached Stutthof, the Nazis began evacuating. Gerda Steinhoff was one of the guards who fled. She managed to blend in with civilians and hide for a time, but it didn't take long before she was captured. She was quickly identified thanks to survivor accounts. Her name appeared again and again in the statements. No one had forgotten her. She was arrested in 1945 and transferred to Gdansk to face trial. During the proceedings, her demeanor was calm. She didn't deny having worked at the camp, but tried to downplay her role. She claimed to have followed orders, to have performed only administrative tasks. However, the testimonies were conclusive. Survivors recounted specific scenes with dates, places, and names. Gerda had been there. She had chosen people to die. She had given orders that ended in the gas chamber. One witness described how Steinhoff pointed with her hand to those who were to be separated. Another said she had seen her beat a pregnant woman. Several agreed that she showed no remorse while carrying out her duties. She was an active part of the system, not a passive piece. And that was what the tribunal considered in issuing the sentence. She was sentenced to death along with other guards and Nazi officers. Her execution was public. She climbed the scaffold with the same serious expression that had accompanied her in Stutthof. She didn't say a word. She didn't cry. She simply looked straight ahead and waited. The rope dropped and her body was left hanging. The crowd that witnessed the scene didn't cheer or shout. They simply watched in silence as a dark chapter closed. Gerda Steinhoff's story was not that of a high-ranking figure. She wasn't a commander or an ideologue, but her role was just as destructive. From her position as a guard, she made decisions that cost lives, and although she tried to dilute her responsibility, the evidence spoke for her. Her case showed that power, even that of a young female guard, could be just as lethal as that of any Nazi leader. From obedient guard to prisoner in Gdansk. Alfreda Monica was only 22 years old when she arrived at Stutthof. She had received brief training at Ravensbrück and was then sent as an auxiliary guard. Unlike other female guards, she had no experience and didn't initially show a dominant attitude. She was quiet, somewhat distant, and kept a neutral expression almost all the time. But that didn't prevent her from becoming involved in the harshest actions of the camp. Her main task was to watch over groups of female prisoners, escort them during transfers, and ensure they obeyed orders. In those roles, she was seen hitting inmates, pushing them, or shouting when they didn't keep up. Some witnesses said that at first she seemed hesitant, but later she began to follow routines without hesitation. She adapted to the system without questioning it. During the selection processes for the gas chambers, Alfreda was also mentioned. She wasn't the one making the decisions, but she was present. She formed part of the guard lines, oversaw the prisoners waiting their turn, and closed doors when necessary. She never raised her hand to protest. She simply complied. That was precisely what stood out most to the witnesses, her complete obedience without showing emotion. One prisoner recalled how Monica, without raising her voice, pushed women onto the trucks that took them to their deaths. Another said she saw her every day, always punctual, always firm. She never mocked anyone, but she never helped either. She kept her distance, as if she was somewhere else. But she was there, in the midst of everything, playing an active role in the process. When the war ended, Alfreda Monica was captured along with other guards. At the trial held in Gdansk, her name came up in several statements. She was clearly identified. Although her role was not as visible as others, her responsibility was clear. She was present, followed orders, and helped keep the system running. During the trial, Monica maintained a reserved demeanor. She listened to the statements without interrupting and barely responded when asked anything. Her answers were short, almost automatic. She said she had done what she was ordered to and that she didn't fully understand what was happening in the camp. But the witnesses saw it differently. For them, it was clear that she knew what was going on. She was not accused of extreme acts or outstanding cruelty, but her role as part of the machine was undeniable. The authorities decided not to impose the death penalty. Instead, she received a sentence of 10 years in prison. She was transferred to a detention center to serve her sentence, far from the public spotlight that surrounded other more notorious guards. In prison, Monica did not cause problems. She followed the rules, avoided conflict, and kept a low profile. She never spoke publicly again about her time at Stutthof, nor was it known that she tried to justify her actions or seek attention. Her story was overshadowed by those of other camp figures, but her participation remained documented in the official records. Years later, after serving part of her sentence, she was released. She moved to a quiet area in Germany, where she lived in anonymity. She gave no interviews and wrote no memoirs. Her name barely appeared in records after the trial. But for those who survived Stutthof, her figure did not disappear. They remembered her as just another guard, someone who fulfilled her role in an extermination system without standing out, but also without resisting. Alfreda Monica's case was different from that of other executed guards. She wasn't seen as sadistic or a key figure, but her constant presence and unquestioning obedience were enough to condemn her. She represented many others who, without being leaders, made it possible for the system to keep operating. The hidden story of Paradis. Paradis was born in 1920 and worked as a waitress before joining the staff at Stutthof. She arrived at the camp when she was about 24 years old and soon took on active roles as a guard. Unlike other women who went unnoticed, quickly gained a reputation for her determined attitude and involvement in surveillance duties. Her name began to appear frequently in prisoner testimonies. She wasn't a supreme authority within the camp, but she had control over specific areas and supervised other guards. In the accounts of survivors, her name was associated with harshness and coldness. She didn't hesitate to raise her hand, shouted orders with a firm tone, and took part in the lines of prisoners selected to be killed. Although she didn't make the final decisions, she carried out orders without objection. One testimony stated that conducted personal searches on female inmates, forced them to undress in the cold, and shouted at them if they didn't comply immediately. Another prisoner remembered her walking with a whip hanging from her belt. Though she didn't always use it, her presence alone was enough to impose discipline. The women who worked in the camp kitchen also mentioned her. They said she would come to inspect the pots, and if she noticed any irregularity in the food distribution, she would apply punishments. During selections, did not remain on the sidelines. She was seen several times guarding groups headed to the gas chambers or to transport trains. Her role was to ensure everything proceeded without resistance. She didn't raise her voice but had a rigid presence. She walked among the lines and watched without blinking. If someone stepped out of line, she pushed them back without hesitation. In the final months of Stutthof's operation, when the Red Army's advance was imminent, Paradis was one of those who remained at her post. She didn't disappear, didn't request a transfer, and showed no fear. She continued performing her duties until the very last days of the camp. That consistency was one of the elements most valued as evidence during her trial. When she was arrested, Paradis did not resist. She was taken to Gdansk, where she faced charges alongside other female guards from the camp. During the hearings, her behavior was firm. She didn't cry or argue. She admitted to having worked as a guard, but downplayed her responsibility. She said she had followed orders and never mistreated anyone on her own initiative. However, the testimonies collected were clear. One witness said she had seen her at multiple selections. Another recounted how guarded prisoners during the marches to the extermination area, ready to intervene if anyone strayed. Several agreed that her attitude was not one of mere obedience, but of active commitment. That perception was key to her conviction. The court decided to impose the death penalty. She was one of the few women publicly executed. On the day of her execution, she appeared with a serious face. She did not speak, did not ask for forgiveness, and showed no reaction to the crowd. She climbed the scaffold with a steady step. The rope dropped without incident. Those who witnessed the act said everything happened in complete silence. Afterward, her name was recorded alongside other camp figures. It did not receive as much media attention as Bachmann's or Steinhoff's, but neither was it forgotten. Her story represented many guards who, without occupying the highest ranks, directly participated in the operation of the camps. Women who didn't create the orders, but executed them without resistance. Paradis left no letters or final statements. She didn't try to clean her image or deny the facts. Her figure remained frozen in the court documents and in the memories of those who passed through Stutthof. She was one more in a chain of surveillance that didn't need shouting to be lethal, and her end closed another page of that dark chapter. The camp's quietest guard. Elisabeth Becker was born in 1923 in Neuteich. During her youth, she worked as an office clerk and was later recruited to receive training as a guard at Ravensbrück. At just 21 years old, she was assigned to the Stutthof camp, where she began performing surveillance duties. Her shy and calm appearance contrasted with the function she carried out. She was at Stutthof for only a few months, but that time was enough for her to be associated with extermination activities. She was seen several times during selections and in control tasks. Though not openly aggressive, she fulfilled her role without objection. She watched over the prisoners, controlled lines, and accompanied selected groups to the trucks. Many witnesses remembered her for her young face and quiet demeanor. Unlike more notorious female guards, Becker was not known for shouting or hitting. Her power lay in her silent execution of every order. She walked among the inmates without breaking pace, but with a fixed gaze. Survivors said she didn't seem to enjoy her work, but neither did she step away from it. She followed protocol to the letter. When the war ended, Elisabeth returned to her hometown and tried to go unnoticed. She didn't think anyone would remember her, but Allied reports and personnel lists from Stutthof helped track her down. She was arrested in 1945 and brought to trial along with 9 other women. Among them were Steinhoff, Paradis and Bachmann. During the trial, Elisabeth was one of the few who expressed remorse. She said she had joined the camp without knowing what it was, and that she felt trapped in a system she couldn't escape. Her defense tried to show that she had no real power, that she merely obeyed. But the witnesses insisted she had been there, had helped maintain order, had been part of the machinery. The court was not swayed by her calm image or words of regret. They ruled that, although her time at Stutthof was brief, she had been involved in the camp's crimes. Her role as a guard, her presence during selections, and her logistical support were enough to hand down a sentence. She was sentenced to death along with other guards. On the day of her execution, Elisabeth remained composed. She wore simple clothes and climbed the scaffold in silence. She did not beg for mercy or speak any final words. She simply waited. When the rope fell, her story ended like that of many other women who had been part of the Nazi system, not publicly notorious, but with actions that left marks on those who survived. After her death, her case was recorded among the youngest executions of the Stutthof trial. She was just 22 years old when she was executed. Her name did not appear in headlines like others, but her participation was clearly documented in the records. She was not a leader or a key figure, but she represented many others who followed orders without resistance. The chapter of Elisabeth Becker showed that even those who seemed to have a minor role could be an essential part of a lethal machine. She did not shout, did not strike, but she was there, fulfilling her duty without fail, and that was enough for justice to reach her. The public executions of the female guards. In April of 1946, Polish authorities decided to carry out a public execution in Gdansk. It was not an improvised act nor limited to a small group. Everything was carefully planned so that it would be witnessed by thousands. They wanted the punishment of the Stutthof guards to remain engraved as a visible and direct warning. The chosen location was a large open area near the station, with enough space to set up gallows and hold the crowd. Preparations began days in advance. Soldiers of the new regime installed elevated wooden platforms and checked every detail. The ropes, posts and trapdoors were tested several times. The authorities wanted to ensure that nothing would go wrong. The event was not only legal, it was symbolic, to demonstrate the end of Nazi dominance and deliver exemplary punishment to those who had been active participants in the crimes. On the morning of the event, thousands of people arrived from various places. Civilians, survivors, schoolchildren, workers and soldiers filled the space in front of the improvised stage. Some came for justice, others out of morbid curiosity, but all knew they were about to witness something that would not be repeated. Soldiers kept order on the sides. No one was allowed to get too close. The atmosphere was tense but orderly. The condemned women were brought to the site in escorted trucks. They walked in a line, hands tied, flanked by armed guards. The crowd watched them in silence. Some were met with shouts, others with murmurs. There were no massive insults, just a charged silence. They ascended one by one to their respective gallows, under the fixed gaze of thousands of witnesses. The authorities checked that everything was in place before giving the signal. When the order was given, the executioners activated the trapdoors without ceremony. The bodies of the guards dropped at the same time without a single scream. The silence of the moment was louder than any word. The crowd did not react immediately. They simply watched. Some lowered their heads, others stood still. The executions had been swift, but the impact was lasting. Soldiers removed the bodies carefully, one by one, while the people continued to watch. No one applauded. There were no celebrations. It was a heavy scene, more like the closing of a wound than a celebration. Several witnesses walked away without saying anything. Some cried silently. Justice had been carried out in front of everyone, but it did not bring immediate relief. The local press covered the event without sensationalism. The photos showed the empty platforms and the faces in the crowd. The newspapers spoke of the end of an era, the closing of a story. There were no martyrs or heroic speeches, only the weight of what had happened. The message was clear. No one who took part in the crimes of Stutthof would go unpunished. Over time, this event became one of the most remembered public acts in post-war Poland. Not so much because of its violence, but because of what it symbolized. It was the end of the female guards who had gone from waitresses to accomplices in extermination. It was the closing of a chapter where ordinary women became part of a lethal system. This was the last trial with public executions of that kind in Poland. After that, death sentences were carried out without the presence of crowds. What happened in Gdansk was never repeated. It remained a visual reminder of what Stutthof had meant, and of what no one ever wanted to see again. The public executions of the Stutthof female guards were the visible closure of one of the darkest episodes of the camp. They were not secret punishments or hidden decisions. They were carried out before thousands of people, with the intent to show that even those who seemed to hold little power could be responsible for serious crimes. These women didn't design strategies or issue orders from offices. They performed daily tasks in a place where killing was part of the routine. Each had a specific role, and that was enough for them to be judged. The sentences and the gallows were not just a reaction, they were a warning. No one who actively participated would go unpunished. Today, their stories are not heard in the streets nor taught in schools, but they remain an uncomfortable reminder, because blind obedience, silence, and habit also build systems like the one that existed at Stutthof. And the question that still lingers is direct. Could something like this happen again, with different faces, in another place, under different orders?